How did the Vikings communicate overseas? By Norse code, of course. The end of the war, its legacy, and Richard Nixon. That's the title of the slideshow today. Concepts. Does the United States win the Vietnam War? Why or why not? Compare and contrast your answer with your answer for the Korean War. And then what impact has the Vietnam War left? Only vocab word for the day is going to be Watergate. You might most likely already know or have an idea of what it is, but let's take a look at some of its impact. The Vietnam War, we're going to be wrapping that up. So it's going to end with a ceasefire. Nixon was elected in 68, and in his campaign, he had talked about Vietnamization, and that was the gradual withdrawal of troops from Vietnam, along with handing off the responsibilities of South Vietnam and its military to withstand the communist government of the North. So Vietnamization comes to a completion by 1973. And if you look on a map today, you'll notice that Vietnam is one entire country. And that is because eventually the United States failed to keep its promises on giving military aid if necessary to South Vietnam if the North showed aggression. And sure enough, in 1975, the North advances on South Vietnam and the United States does not take action. And whether they should or shouldn't have, that's a different story, but the way the story ends is communism does advance into South Vietnam and Vietnam becomes a country. And that brings us to another important question, or a rather simple question, and that is, was the Vietnam War a victory or a loss for the United States? If you go back to the start of the Vietnam portion of this unit, we talked about why the United States is there. And the United States from the beginning was there because of the thoughts of containment, Eisenhower's idea of the domino theory. One country gets communism or becomes communist, then the neighboring countries around it fall, and so on and so forth. That was in existence, so you go to Vietnam and you try and stop the advancement of communism. And if that's what you're basing it on, then the Vietnam War is a loss. The fact of the matter is that Vietnam was split into North and South, and 10 years after Tonkin Gulf incident, Vietnam was one communist country. In that sense, it is strictly a loss. For the United States, whether the war is a win or a loss, to me, isn't the most important aspect, and it loses sight of the bigger picture. So some of the conclusions real quick for the war then are what? And I'd say there are a few things that stand out just off the top of my head, and one is going to be the environmental and uh, human effects that napalm and Agent Orange have in and on the Vietnamese people. The vegetation and the damage that the chemicals did were horrendous, and the birth defects and things of that nature down the road on humans, that of course was a very negative effect of these things. The second thing I'll point out is the My Lai massacre. And it's not that the My Lai massacre goes to point out a a huge problem of the entire war, but what it does is it certainly accentuates and makes very clear a couple of main issues that come out of the Vietnam War. And one is that credibility gap of what the government is saying and versus what's actually happening. You know, the My Lai massacre happens. It's kind of brushed aside. The government isn't paying attention to it until all of a sudden it's put out there by journalists, and then further investigation proves that it occurs. And before you know it, the United States has individuals who are being charged with crimes and sent to jail because of it. That is problematic for the government and the trust from its citizens. On top of that, the My Lai massacre also creates a low morale for the troops, and that low morale was a continuation of what really was a poor strategy, as outlined by General Westmoreland, the strategy of attrition. The third conclusion I want to draw is in reference to the soldiers, specifically the comparison in how soldiers came home from World War II to heroes like Welcome, and how soldiers come back from the Vietnam War. They find themselves under a lot of scrutiny as if they are to blame for the war in Vietnam. And it has been a harsh legacy and a difficult challenge for veterans of the Vietnam War to overcome. Really, the from their return home, even to this day, then into tomorrow. That's a legacy that that veterans of this war are still dealing with. Additionally, we should keep one other point in mind regarding the veterans of that war. This is the last time there's been a draft. Every war from here on out, it has been fought by an basically a volunteer military. If you are in the military, it is now by your choice. Now let's move on to Richard Nixon. He is the final president in the Vietnam War as the war comes to an end in 63 and Vietnamization is complete. South Vietnam has control, and his goals of completing the war has certainly given him a strong show of support across the country, as you can see from the map here. But we're going to find out that is also going to be very short-lived. The reason all of that is short-lived is because of one of the most infamous scandals there has been in the United States, and that is the Watergate scandal. Just to be clear, the term Watergate now refers to the scandal, but Watergate is a hotel where the scandal took place. The scandal itself has to do with with a burglary and tapping of phones, because this is where the 1972 Democratic National Convention is being held. And those doing the bugging or the tapping have to do with Richard Nixon's administration, at least so they find out. So some of the timeline works like this. In 72 is the Democratic National Convention. At the Watergate Hotel, the burglary, the tapping of phones, photographing of documents takes place here. There's an investigation. Nixon wants the investigation to stop. The FBI continues it. The burglars, they're going to go on trial. Meanwhile, Nixon is going to win the election of 72, remains president in 73. All the while, we start to see more White House officials start to be brought down. Before long, Nixon is going to be investigated by the Senate, and it certainly appears that Nixon has an involvement which he clearly denied earlier, and Nixon is going to be impeached. Now, keep in mind, an impeachment is not what kicks a president out of office. An impeachment is um, going to put the president on trial. And he is impeached, but before he can actually be kicked out of office, and Nixon would have been removed from office, Nixon decides that he is going to resign instead. In the end, as history has it, Nixon resigns August 8th, 1974, as having been one of three presidents to be impeached. Can you name the other two? And then he is going to be the only president who will resign from office. That has never happened in United States history prior to Nixon and after Nixon. However, President Nixon is going to avoid jail time. His vice president, Gerald Ford, who takes over for him as president after he resigns, is going to pardon him. And the big problem with this is the fact that the United States, in its population, its citizens, have been growing very tired and weary and doubtful of the government. Now, because of this, they're only growing more cynical of the government, and really that has persisted to this day as we see a lot of the same uncertainty revolving politics and what the true intentions of people in politics are. From a pop culture standpoint, Watergate is exceptionally famous in the sense that anytime there is some sort of scandal, oftentimes you're going to hear the word gate at the end of it. The Patriots recently had Spygate, for example. Well, that's due in part to Watergate. That's it today. We'll see you next time.